Imagine $70 million raised for Imagine No Malaria. Imagine we together in the United States, in the Central Conferences, started over 2,000 new faith communities and new congregations. Imagine all of the ministry that's been done in our communities and all that God has been doing in and through us. Imagine all God has yet for us to do. Imagine all of these things. You know, I was inspired by that video yesterday about grace and the why of grace. And you know, when I think about the world today and what's happening in our world today, I think God's grace is needed now more than ever. You know, when we look at people who are dying of malaria, it is God's grace through United Methodist that we've cut the death rate in half. You know, as we look at the present political situation and the election, can I get an amen? We need God's grace. And I'm not talking about cheap grace here. We need God's grace. You know, I believe God's grace is needed in the world more than at any other time. I also find that God's healing is needed in the world. And one of the places that I'm finding and seeing God's grace alive and real and happening is through vital congregations. Congregations that are growing up, the vitality, the capacity for mission and ministry and engaging in the community. I'm finding, though, that these congregations are congregations that are excelling in some of the areas that we've just said, these are the areas we want to excel in. We want to excel in disciples in worship. We want to excel in disciples in small groups. We want to excel in disciples reaching out in mission. We want to excel in disciples giving to mission. These are areas that we want to continue to excel in. And to do that, we need to look at numbers. And that's why I'm here to talk with you about numbers. Isn't this exciting? I mean, really. I know you've been waiting the whole time for this presentation to talk about numbers and the exciting things that we can find out about numbers. So it's my hope that on your cell phone, your iPad, or whatever you've got with you, you've got a calculator, because we're going to be burning that thing up today. So we're just going to talk about numbers. Nick, at the age of 21, is called the metrics man where he works. Nick works at Dick's Sporting Goods. And Nick reports to the managers every week on the store's metrics, what's happening. Now, I'm convinced that Cub memorabilia is going to spike this week. Is that true? Do you think it's going to spike this week? And there are going to be a lot of people shopping at Dick's Sporting Goods. So Nick helps the managers see where they are in terms of their sales goals, in terms of what's happening in the store. But Nick also reports about some other things. He reports how many people, after they made a purchase, went home and on the web page filled out a questionnaire or a survey and responded to that survey. Nick also looks within the surveys and the data if the person who bought something at Dick's and filled out the survey mentioned the name of the salesperson. And also if the person also mentioned the product that they bought or mentioned how the salesperson was helpful to them. Nick is measuring what's happening, not just in terms of sales, but in terms of people connecting with the shoppers. We in the United Methodist Church have been wanting to figure out more about what's happening in the United Methodist Church. And so in 2010, the United Methodist Church conducted the most robust assessment of our stats that any mainline denomination has ever done. And through that, we learned a lot of things. For instance, one of the things we learned was that the most productive year of a pastor's ministry, in terms of being in the same congregation, the most productive year in the same congregation was year 11. Year 11 was the most fruitful, most result-oriented year of pastors, more than pastors in their first year, their second year, their third year. And so we wanted to better understand that, what was going on. And we wondered, why wasn't the 12th year the most fruitful? And what we found was that Towers Watson, who did this study, what they found was that we didn't have enough people in their 12th year to study and to come out with a reliable pool of people. So what we learned from that was if pastors are serving well, the longer they serve in the same congregation, the more fruitful their ministry is. These were some of the things we learned. We also set a goal. We realized that we had 14.7% of our congregations were highly vital. And so we said we wanted to double that. And in the last quadrennium, we did double the number of highly vital congregations here in the United States. So looking at the data, looking at the numbers, really gives us some clues about what is happening, and then how do we use that data. Now, at that same time when we were doing that study of our statistics, we were also asking questions of people in our denomination. And one of the things they reported back to us is the United Methodist Church is averse to data, to metrics, to numbers. They just don't like to look at numbers. And what Towers Watson said is, and your statistics prove that. That's what they said to us. I'm just reporting back. They said, you don't like to look at data, you don't like to look at the metrics, you don't want to measure things, and by the way, your statistics show that. So in the United Methodist Church, we have a hard time with numbers and data for a good reason. That's because 70%, more than 70% of our clergy lean on the relational side. Lean on the relational side. And so one of the things that we know is that people who lean on the relational side want to say that numbers is not about relationships. Numbers is a business model. And we shouldn't be using a business model in the church. The other 30% lean more into the strategic side. And actually, they know their numbers. District superintendents that visit churches or visit with pastors and ask them how things are going. These are the pastors that say, well, we're up by 5 in worship attendance this year. We've made X number of new disciples. They lean into that side. The reality is, it's not about one side or the other side. It takes both of these working together to help the church move forward. And that's some of the things we want to talk with you about today. We want to talk with you today about counting and measuring and the difference between them. There's a difference between counting and measuring. And what does that look like and mean? We want to talk with you about data as being a tool for understanding and for wisdom. For understanding and for wisdom. We want to talk with you today about data for goal setting and identifying outcomes. We want to talk about healthy ways to use data. One of the things we learned in this last quadrennium is that data was used as a stick for pastors and congregations. Not a helpful model. Not a helpful model. We want to talk about what we are learning about using data, And we're also going to talk with you about some examples of how data is being used in a couple of conferences. To do this, we have 3 people who have been using data and talking about data and making progress in the areas that they work. So we have Lisa Greenwood, Vice President from the Texas Methodist Foundation for Leadership Ministry. And I just want to say a word about the Texas Methodist Foundation. The Texas Methodist Foundation has been one of the most dynamic and important edge organizations within the life of the United Methodist Church. They have, amen, all right, they have been holding symposiums, think tanks, bringing people together from around the country. They have been supporting Gil Rendell's work and the things that have been coming out from Gil Rendell. And so let's share our appreciation today for the Texas Methodist Foundation. It's also an example of edge organizations that can be used in your conference to continue to further your mission. We also have with us Hecotr Buros. Hector is the Director of Connectional Ministries in the Greater New Jersey Conference, and he'll be giving an example of how it's being used there. And then also B.T. Williamson, who is the Assistant to the Bishop in the Texas Conference, and will also, all right, Texas is in the house, he'll also give an example of how they're using data in their conference. Won't you welcome Lisa?
So Bishop Dick has shared with us the strategic direction for the next quadrennium, and particularly the effort to double the number of vital congregations. So this is going to require intentionality, of course, on our part, especially in the use of data and our ability to name desired outcomes. As Bishop Schol has pointed out, the emphasis on data inevitably surfaces a good bit of anxiety in our midst, and not without reason, because data has often been misused. At minimum, it's a benign waste of time. Pastors spend precious time and energy collecting all this data and turning it in, and it doesn't get used or looked at. And so clergy become resentful of the request for data. At worst, data is used as a stick, as Bishop Schol said, and the numbers are seen as the sum total assessment of a congregation's ministry, when they don't come close to painting the full picture of that ministry. So clergy are afraid they will be evaluated solely by those numbers. As a result, we hear things like, ministry can't be measured, and data doesn't really work in our situation. And then we fall into a significant piece of work avoidance, in which we let ourselves off the hook by claiming that data is meaningless. So this morning, we want to look at the appropriate use of data in the work of increasing congregational vitality. To be clear from the beginning, there is an essential role for data, and it is not as a stick. Data is not so much summative as formative. Data and numbers do not give us the sum total picture in final evaluation of ministry, summative, but rather data is a tool in a process for assessment and adjustment, in the process of forming strategies and action plans. Data is best used in a formative way, not a summative way. Now, these are not new conversations, of course, but they're important conversations for us to have together, and especially in this room, over and over again, because it's pretty easy to fall into old familiar patterns, and particularly when anxiety is high in our midst. So we can't talk about the appropriate use of data without understanding the absolutely essential work of clarifying our purpose and defining our outcomes. Understanding what we mean by outcomes is worth spending some time on, because without outcomes, gathering data is not only unhelpful, but unnecessary. And in fact, frankly, without clearly defined outcomes, folks are just going to work to make themselves tired, not to make anything different. So we'll start today by getting clear on what we mean by outcomes. And we're going to start by using a familiar basic systems model. Edwards Deming, who is attributed with turning around Japanese manufacturing after World War II, wrote the book Out of Crisis, and uses this basic model. And originally for manufacturing, we can think in terms of inputs used, tools, facilities, materials. Throughputs are those assembly lines, those activities to create a product, and then the outputs are those products themselves. Now, the nonprofit dilemma is that nonprofits routinely do not know what they produce. And when we don't know what we're trying to produce, we put energy into inputs and throughputs. In the church, we often find ourselves focusing on buildings and budgets and on our ministry activities. You heard Bishop Schneezy give the example yesterday of trying to find out what was happening in a youth group, and they told him about their facilities and the new van that they'd bought and the youth director that they had hired. Now, we are seeing a shift. Frankly, the paradigm that we have inherited and sort of nestled safely, comfortably into in the church is that our desired outcome has been more members and happy clergy and satisfied congregations, right? Our systems are all set up this way, our reward systems. How do we know a clergy is doing a good job? The SPRC isn't getting any complaints. Everybody's happy. How do we know DSs are doing a good job? Well, their clergy are happy and there aren't any complaints from congregations, right? Our reward systems are set up for the outcome to be happy clergy and satisfied congregations. Now, the shift that's happening, and we're seeing it everywhere, you know, is that we are beginning to see ourselves not as the object of our own affection, but rather the instruments that God can use. We as clergy, as leaders, as members of congregations, as congregations themselves, are the inputs, the tools that God can use to bring about a better world. And so the outcome is, in fact, the disciple, the changed life who will change the world. So this brings us back to the Deming's model. And if we're going to use the Deming's model in the social sector, we have to adapt it and add a layer, really. And that is to say, there's a difference between outputs and outcomes. Even though outputs and outcomes are both representative of the fruit of our ministries and resources, there's a difference because outputs are the result of activities and can often be quantified, and outcomes are the impact. So, for example, there's a new adult Bible study program in a congregation, and the result was that 60 adults showed up. Wonderful. They are now a part of an activity at the church, but the impact of that Bible study over, say, a 12-week period is that 8 new families are attending worship, and 15 of those adults are volunteering in the local elementary school tutoring because of what they've experienced in that Bible study. Now you have outcome. Now you have impact. The critical work that we need to do in the church is to clearly identify our desired outcomes. That is the difference that we are called to make in the world. And then go back and identify the resources and activities that we need to bring about those outcomes. So Simon Sinek has given us some language, very simple language around this, as has Michael Jr., we saw yesterday in the video, and that is to start with why. And when we start with why, and we're clear on our why, and we know our why, then the what and the how will follow. So the truth is, we know more about how and what we do than why. And so it's human nature. We tend to put our energy into the places that we know more about, resources and activities. But without outcomes, without understanding our purpose, our why, we will just make ourselves tired chasing the latest trending ministry craze. So when we are clear on our purpose, we will discover the resources that are needed to realize that purpose. But when we start with our resources, we often find ourselves in a scarcity mindset, wringing our hands over what we don't have enough of, and rarely do we find our way to purpose. So we start by defining our outcomes, and then we work back to the resources and ministries needed to fulfill those outcomes. So a working definition of an outcome. For the church, an outcome is the difference that you believe God has called you to make in this next chapter of your life. Now, each part of that is important. So there is a measurable, describable difference. So the Christian faith at its core is about transformation, is it not? It's about change that happens in our lives and in the world. There is a difference. When we are about our work, there is something different in us and in the world. That next part that you believe God has called you to make, the key element here, of course, is discernment around God's call. This is not about self-appointed preferences. This is always about God-appointed mission. So it's not what do we want to do next, but what is God calling us to make different in this next chapter of your life. So an outcome is not for all time. Outcomes get adjusted regularly. They are for a defined, relatively brief period of time. 3 to 5 years is a good time in there, and then they get adjusted along the way. Outcomes are steps in the larger vision that God has for us and for the world. So outcome work that we have been doing with congregations and with our district superintendents and bishops and leaders is some of the hardest work that we have done. And we have made some distinctions that have been helpful in our work, and so perhaps they will be helpful to you. That's the distinction between aspirations and priorities and outcomes. And I think at the general church level, we have made these distinctions. We are an aspirational people, glory be. We need aspirations. They give us a point on the horizon. And as a United Methodist Church, we have a strong and important, impactful aspiration as a mission statement. We want to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I can't say enough how important that is because it gives us that point on the horizon that keeps us directionally aligned. And then when we drill down into that aspiration, we are getting better at setting priorities. In the general church, we have the 4 focus areas. We see all the time in congregations and in annual conferences, priorities set around attracting younger generations or impacting generational poverty in our communities. These are priorities that we set. When we get to outcomes, this is where the conversation often stalls. It is so difficult to drill down deeper into that measurable change that we're trying to make, that God is calling us to make. And so in our work with DSs and with congregations, they'll bring back something that they think is an outcome, and it's an aspiration, clearly. And so we'll say, you need to get more specific. And they'll come back with that same aspiration and 12 adjectives describing that aspiration. So it's just hard work is what I want to say. I applaud the general church for saying, okay, we're going to set some goals and they're going to be measurable because we have got to gauge whether or not we're on track here. So some important things to remember about outcomes, and then I'm going to move to how data fits in with outcomes, our use of data. So first off is that outcomes are proximate steps on the way to a larger vision that God has for our lives and for the world. So imagine maybe you've heard the story of the mother and son living on a farm. It's late at night, and the mother becomes concerned that the barn door isn't locked, and so she sends her son out to go and check the barn door. And he steps outside armed only with a flashlight, and he comes back a couple of minutes later and says, "I can't do this, I can't see the barn." And she says, "You don't need to be able to see the barn. You know it's there. You just need to be able to see to the end of the light. And walk to the end of the light, and it will guide you to the next piece," right? So if the barn is that changed world, and we can't see the barn, but we know it exists out there, we need to take the next proximate step that gets us on our way toward that changed world. So, for example, a conference decides to eradicate poverty in a particular zip code, and perhaps one of those priorities in that aspirational goal of eradicating poverty, one of the priorities is to increase high school graduation rates. Well, a proximate step or an outcome along the way might be to increase the number of third graders reading at or above reading level, because they know the correlation between third grade reading levels and graduation rates, right? When we say we are making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, we need to be able to define what that means in our context, in our particular time. What is the change that we are looking for in people's lives and in our mission field? So next, and I've said this and can't emphasize it enough, and that is that outcomes require discernment. That means genuine, intentional listening. It means prayer. It means conversation with God, but also with each other. It doesn't happen in an instant. And so some of the questions that we encourage people to ask is, who are we now? And who is our neighbor now? And what is the difference God is calling us to make? Now notice the now. I think it's so critical that we do that, because, and Bishop Farr gave the perfect example last night. You know, we think we know our conference. We may have been a member of that conference for 30 years. I know my conference, right? But it is extremely important that we look at who we are now and who our neighbors are now. Sometimes we don't ask those questions when we think we know the answer, but it is critical that we take an honest look at where we are right now. Asking questions like, what do we need to learn and from whom? And seeing our neighbors as teachers and really doing that listening work. It's important to limit the number. It's very difficult for organizations to work with multiple outcomes at one time. Outcomes are not action steps. Your clearly defined outcomes help you structure your priorities and your action steps. So it's important that you focus your efforts on a limited number of outcomes in your annual conference. So I said this earlier, I think it's important to remember that we start with the outcomes. We start with the why. We start with the outcomes, and we go back to the resources and the activities that are needed, that are the right resources and the right activities geared toward those outcomes. So we know that the annual conference is the place where resources are directed. And so even more important that at this level, we are clear on our outcomes so that we are investing the energy of our leaders and our resources towards the right kinds of ministries and in the right places. And finally, that outcomes are describable and measurables. Aspirations are harder to measure, but outcomes have discernible change that can be measured. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about data and the use of data. When we go back to that Deming's model, and this is the same sort of logic model that's in the connectional table report, and we can see that there are some that are more easily counted, so we're going to call those countables. These are the data that we can count, how many resources we have, how many activities, the results that we can quantify. Measurables are more qualitative. They tend to depend on descriptions of the change that's desired, that will be, and what will be different if change is taking place. These are our stories, things that we can describe even if we can't put numbers to them. So we notoriously fall into the trap of either or. We focus so much on numbers that we forget to look at the impact, or we focus so much on stories that we fail to hold ourselves accountable to an accurate picture of our use of resources. So we need both. We need counting and measuring. Counting is actually an extremely important part of our work together. We are inundated with data in the United Methodist Church, and we often don't put it to good use. So it's really important to remember that data is part of a larger process, specifically in assessing whether or not we're making progress on our desired outcomes, right? So language that, again, has been helpful to us, and it's the organizational principle of knowledge management. So this notion of moving from data to information to knowledge and wisdom, and then ultimately to action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one so we can distinguish. So data in this construct is defined as sort of a set of discrete, objective facts. They're insensitive. And what I mean by that is they're not sensitive to things like the weather or personalities or other intangible factors. They're just numbers that stand alone. So take average worship attendance, one of the measures of vitality. So data refers to the average worship attendance on any given Sunday. And it's insensitive to whether or not there was a holiday and whether or not you have a guest preacher and all those other things. It's just a discrete number, right? We move from data to information when we work with numbers through contextualizing and categorizing and condensing and calculating, and this gives us information. So average worship attendance begins to give us information when we track it over seasons, right? And when we compare it year over year and we see the trends, now we have some information. We move from information to knowledge by comparing and connecting and discerning with those numbers. So taking that same example of average worship attendance we take average worship attendance of a congregation and look at that trend over time. And then we look at the demographics, let's say in a 10-mile radius around that congregation, and we begin to compare the growth pattern. Now we have some knowledge about whether or not that congregation is really vital. Are they tracking with the growth pattern? Maybe they're growing, but at a slower rate than the population, so they're actually losing market share. Now we have some knowledge to work with so that we can then create action steps out of that and strategic plans. The whole point of collecting data is to guide strategy, to make decisions about the best use of resources and ministries and where to invest our energy. What I want you to hear is that data is a critical starting point, but it's just that, it's a starting point. It's only useful when we appropriately work with the numbers in the context of the difference that we're trying to make. So some important things to remember about data and the work of utilizing data. First is that data is often a substitute for an intangible quality that we're trying to measure. Now, social scientists call this proxy variables, something that you can measure as a stand-in for something that you can't easily measure. So let me give you a couple of examples. So Again, average worship attendance. We want to measure people's commitment to being a faithful follower of Christ, and so we track their worship attendance. Now, we can't see inside their hearts to see how close to Christ they are, but we can make a correlation between their commitment to Christ and their attention to being part of a community of faith. So average worship attendance is actually a proxy variable for changed life, for discipleship. So here's another example. A friend of mine pastors a church, an inner city church in a large community, and they have made significant changes to their ministry. And it has had profound impact on their community. They know that, but they weren't sure how to measure it, and they wanted to be able to tell their story in a more concrete way. So they went to a local university and they told them, we want to measure three things. We want to measure physical health and see if that has improved in our community. We want to measure the economics and see if those have improved. And they wanted to measure sort of joy, and so they called it mutual delight. So you can imagine these statisticians at the university were saying, now the first two I think we can handle, but the third one was harder, mutual delight. So here's what they measured. They measured the number of parties that people were having in the community. Parties are the proxy variable to measure joy and well-being. So data are often proxy variables. It's essential that we don't lose sight of the intangible quality that we are trying to measure. Sometimes we can get so caught up in the numbers, we forget that they are actually pointing to something else, that intangible quality that we are trying to measure toward that outcome. So data points to the present. This is really important as well because it's a snapshot of our current reality. It's a moment in time. We often say that the first task of a leader is to paint an honest picture of our current reality. This is where data is really important and very useful. And thank you, Bishop Farr, for your own confession that plays right into this. So what happens when we don't use current data is that we don't have an accurate picture of our current reality, right? So it's critical that we use data to assess where we are currently and to hold us accountable to how we're really doing. Outcomes, in contrast, often get measured over time because they measure change that is happening. And of course, data is helpful in that process as well. So data is best used as part of a larger process of assessment, discernment, conversation about whether we're accomplishing the vision that God has laid out for us and the change that God is calling us to make, and what adjustments need to be made in how we're using our resources and investing our energy. So in summary, we need data. We need data about our churches, our communities, and our world. We need records and trends and dashboards, which give us a means to understand our current circumstances. They are valuable tools for conversation, but they are only tools, and they are not helpful if they are not turned into knowledge that then helps guide our action steps. So the truth is we need better ways to measure our fruitfulness. It is one of the significant challenges for the church today. But in this work, data can be our friend when we pay attention to the numbers and we do the appropriate discernment work around those numbers. We can be wiser about how we use our resources and how we measure change that is occurring. So counting and measuring are simply tools we use to hold ourselves accountable to the purpose that God has for us and for our world.
Buenos dias. Good morning. I am Hecotr Buros, and by the grace of God, guys, let me first say where I'm from. And by the grace of God, I have the honor to serve as Director of Connectional Ministries in the United Methodist Church of Greater New Jersey. Yeah, Jersey is in the house. Our conference has been using data to achieve significant outcomes to increase congregational vitality, make new disciples, and engage more deeply in community transformation. We set God-sized, ambitious goals for ourselves through a strategic planning effort back in the year 2013. And among other things, we said that we wanted a complete turnaround to grow the number of highly vital congregations from 14% in our conference to 41%. And we are on our way. We're making progress, and we have reached as many as 33% of highly vital congregations in Greater New Jersey. We've also wanted to grow the number of worshipers in small groups from 43% to 75%, and today we are at 78%. We said that we wanted to grow the number of worshipers engaged in hands-on mission, making a difference in their local communities from a low of 8% to 40%, and today we are at 50% of engagement. We dreamed and committed ourselves to start 90 new faith communities, and we're making progress. We have 24 new faith communities. And also we said that we wanted to grow the number of worshipers, the congregations that are growing in worship attendance to 51%. And we're making progress, and we currently are at 33% of our churches growing. We also, in the last 2 years, developed new resources to equip our local congregations and our transformational leaders. And we set some goals of engagements for these resources. We wanted to see 300 pastors in coaching. And today, there have been 189 clergy that have experienced at least one season of coaching. We wanted 200 churches engaged in Team Vital, our new congregational training and strategic planning process. And today, we have had 78 congregations be part of that. We wanted 300 pastors in our PACE groups pursuing clergy excellence. And today, we have 223. These are some of the goals that we have set for ourselves, but they are not our outcomes. Our outcomes are focused on achieving a regenerative conference and a congregation. Our outcomes are focused on building the capacity and sustainability in the areas of leadership, congregational vitality, mission, and financial resources for ministry. Today, I would like to share with you briefly 3 outcomes that we have set in Greater New Jersey and how we are using data to inform our decisions, bring about change, and develop strategies to achieve them. The first outcome is to lessen the financial impact apportionments are having on our most productive and fruitful congregations and increase conference dollars for resourcing congregations to grow in their vitality. Take a look at this chart for a moment. This chart highlights the collection rate of Greater New Jersey on its apportionment over the past 10 years. As you can see, our collection rate went from 85 collected in 2006 down to a low of 78% in 2011. While the collection rate was going down, we were increasing the budget of our churches and the budget amount we apportion churches each year. This meant that our most fruitful churches were paying an increased share just to achieve a level of spending that allowed us to keep pace with the rising costs. We also found the churches who were not paying 100% were simply demoralized. As we studied the problem, we realized that if we held the budget flat, hear this, that if we held our budget flat or even reduced the budget and worked strategically with churches that were not paying 100%, we could collect not only a higher percentage, but even more money for ministry and resourcing. And it's working. While decreasing how much we apportion churches, the given percentage continues to rise, and this year we are on pace to collect more than 87%. This improvement has generated more than $1 million, which has allowed us to hire 4 new staff positions that are directly resourcing congregations in new and exciting ways. We took several steps to accomplish our outcome. First, we developed a traffic light system that shows every church in either green, yellow, or red, with the performance on apportionments giving a particular month as compared to the same month in the previous year. A church in green was a church that was improving. Yellow meant that they were a little behind, and red meant they were significantly behind. This meant that instead of us sending the same message to every church, we could send targeted messages and letters of gratefulness and encouragement. And it also helped our DSs focus their time. We also began to work with churches who were not giving at their 100% level and guided them to set goals to achieve that 100%. We asked them how many years between 3 and 5 they wanted to take to reach that 100%, and what percentage they envisioned giving each of those years. We also provided them with specialized workshops and resources to assist them in that journey. And it worked. Today we have a greater percentage of churches giving 100% than at any time since 2002. These 2 strategies, having churches set goals and targeting who and how we message about apportionments, has helped us achieve the outcome that we desired: greater financial security and increased dollars to resource congregations. Our second outcome has to do with creating regenerative congregations that are leading the way in Greater New Jersey. We found that our most fruitful, sustaining congregations in Greater New Jersey, that have people engaged in mission, people given to mission, people engaged in faith development and making new disciples, were congregations worshiping 125 or more in worship. That's the number for Greater New Jersey. And then we use this figure as our benchmark. And then we identify churches with the potential who are just under 125 and focus on resourcing them to grow them to more than 125 in worship. The cabinet also pays close attention to these churches. District superintendents share with each other constantly and during appointment time how their 125 churches are doing, and if there should be an appointment change or a change in strategy. And it is working. The number of 125 churches has grown by 12%, and we are encouraged by the progress being made by those identified with that potential. And the third outcome we are just beginning to look at and use data to understand is maximizing the impact of our congregational development grants. Are there things that we can see in the data that points to whether or not a church is a good investment for making a congregation development grant? Here's some of the things that we are collecting data to better understand. In addition to all the data available on the 5 key indicators of vitality, we are collecting data on the average square footage of the building per worshiper. Churches that have a very high square footage per worshiper means more money going into maintenance instead of mission. The amount of deferred maintenance on the building. Because it is hard for a small congregation to turn around with a lot of deferred maintenance, particularly if they have large buildings. Debt. The greater the debt, the less available for mission and ministry. And the percentage of apportionments and insurance and pension paid. Because churches behind on these have a hard time turning around. Churches can certainly overcome any of these obstacles, but in combination, they can be a forecast for significant decline and eventually closure. We find that an individual pastor who is a turnaround leader can go in and turn a situation around. But it is only a good investment to do this if we have a stable of turnaround leaders who are ready to go in and change the situation and then follow them with the same type of leader. The knowledge and the wisdom that we are acquiring will help us invest our congregational development monies in churches with greater potential and that can be sustainable in the long term. And as we're working with intentional outcomes, we're learning. Here are a few of the things that we're learning from outcomes and goal setting and using data. We're learning that it's better to let congregations and clergy set their own goals rather than us telling them what the goals should be. Congregations tend to outpace themselves against their goal when they own the goals and the appropriate resourcing is tied with those goals. We're learning that data does not provide us with all the answers, but it points us in the right direction. We're learning that there's always outliers in the data and result, but that we should not be chasing after those outliers or become paralyzed by the outliers. They are outliers. We learn from them, but we focus on the core data results. And as Bishop Schol mentioned earlier, we're learning that data is never enough or a replacement for relationships. Relationship and data must go hand in hand. Greater New Jersey is increasing it's achieving its goals, becoming more regenerative, and increasing morale and results by setting clear outcomes and appropriate use of data.
Good morning, saints. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to share some reflections on the use of data in cultivating vital congregations. The three examples that I'd like to share with you this morning is how data has been informing the conversations in our own annual conference as we've sought to form vital congregations. And first of all, we're going to explore how strategies related to health benefits have accrued to the advantage of local congregations. We'll consider how county seat and large towns represent a key component of vital congregations. Lastly, we'll examine how young clergy who are under the age of 35 are impacting congregational vitality. The sources of these reports today will be coming from the end-of-the-year reports that our local congregations file from Ezra and from the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. We look first of all at data as a confirmation of strategy. We're a self-insured annual conference. One of the goals that we have is to recognize that healthy pastors and families contribute to vital congregations. One of the ways that we address that through our group health benefits program is a disease management component. It looks at 5 serious chronic conditions. A lot of our clergy are affected by these. One of our strategies that we created in 2006 is called the Day of Wellness. It was done in partnership with Houston Methodist Hospital. And you can see the 6 components of a day of wellness: coaching, superfood, stress management, nutrition, strength-building exercises, stretching, flexibility, all designed to help put one on a lifestyle management program. But as a part of this experience, we invited participants to be a part of an ongoing study. And our benefits advisor received permission from those who attended to collect and to report the annual conference's progress in addressing these 5 conditions. In addition to that, we also waived the generic copays on the drugs that supported a healthier lifestyle. And what we discovered after 9 years of experience, that we had a 63% participation rate in the wellness program and disease management. The industry standard across the United States is 15%. We insure over 2,100 members. 560 of those persons have one or more of those 5 conditions that need management. And out of that group, 56% of our total health cost can be attributed to those 560 participants. So getting healthy and staying healthy is an important part, not only for the clergy well-being, but for vital congregations. Here's what we discovered. In the 9-year period, we reduced our emergency room visits. We also reduced our inpatient hospital admissions. And what that meant for us was, as we compared cost, rather than trending at the projected 9% increase per year, our record was less than 3%. So in conclusion, we discovered that our wellness strategies dramatically improved the quality of life for clergy and their families, at the same time reducing our health costs. What did that mean for the annual conference? We experienced a $1.1 billion reduction in apportionments, and we directed those funds to keep the budget stable and then increase the programs and the services that we provided to our local congregations. Let's consider data as an indicator of strategy. As we look at an indicator of strategy, I'd like to identify a confluence of 3 factors. Key contributors to the annual conference's witness, a performance matrix that identifies future opportunities, and the significance of ministry in our county seat towns. Through the services of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, we just completed a 20-year analysis as of 2015. The principal criteria for this evaluation centered in 9 categories of average worship attendance. And here you can see the different categories that were the constants. From these categories of worship attendance, we examined indicators of fruitfulness, such as average worship attendance, professions of faith, confirmation, numbers of children and youth, the per capita giving, and the total giving. And these were the results of some vital congregations. There were 107 local congregations that have an average worship attendance of more than 200. That represents 16.2% of the total congregations in our annual conference. We had 128 of them in 1995. We've reduced slightly to 2015. But as you look at the chart, you'll notice that the average worship attendance and professions of faith remained rather static and steady. But note the shift in where our children and youth are involved in church. They're in these 107 local congregations at the rate of 86 and 82%. Our per capita giving is higher in these churches, as well as the total dollars contributed to the annual conference. These contributions to the annual conference witness are reflected in the statistical measures that we've been tracking for 20 years. A very large church with 1,000 or more accounts for 40% of the witness. Large churches and mid-sized large congregations account for another 40% of that witness. So these 107 churches are vital, and they require attention and maintenance for their growth and future vitality. One of the interesting footnotes to the study of these churches vis-a-vis their average worship attendance is whenever a church drops from a category level, the time it takes to recover is far greater than the time it takes to decline. For example, church might drop from the 1,000 level average worship attendance over a 3-year period, but the recovery may take 6 to 9 years for that to transpire. So it's important that we keep these congregations vital and healthy and growing. Another way that data helped us define strategy, and this is that second portion of Confluence, was through a matrix assessment. And here you can see on the sideways past fruitfulness. This was the average worship attendance change from 2010 to 2015. And then we looked at the future potential of congregations. What will their population change be over the next 5 years? And then you could put a matrix of growth in attendance, but no growth in population, or growth in both attendance and population, and so on. The Lewis Center for Leadership provided the data on past fruitfulness, and RRC Incorporated from Bryan provided the population profile by ethnicity within a 3-mile radius of the congregation. Population change looks at affinity groups. 80% of an ethnic population provides a fixed identity, and less than 80% represents a multiracial congregation. From these matrix position, and you'll notice we didn't put any church names in there so as to protect the innocent. You'll notice from these matrix positions where you identify congregations, you will find those that have the greatest opportunity with the right leadership for growth and vitality. For example, a congregation in the growth, no growth quadrant is demonstrating creativity and strategy. And so we ask, how can we sustain them into the future? A congregation in the growth quadrant has a witness to share. So we ask, how can we replicate those congregations? A congregation with no growth in a growth area quadrant may not be in alignment with the opportunities that are around them. And so we ask whether leadership might be an issue. And finally, a congregation in a no growth quadrant is one for which we have concern about its future, and we ask the question, how can we support and triage this congregation? Leads us to a third confluence. To address the urgent needs of congregation where leadership issues or triage responses are under consideration, we have followed suit, as many of your conferences have, through what we call our Vibrant Church Initiative. The local congregation must take the initiative to invite the VCI team to assist them. From there, VCI begins with an assessment of the congregation's readiness for change management. We utilize the resources of ProSci Incorporated, a nationally recognized change management consulting firm. Then we work through a consulting process, and we create 2 to 5 prescriptions for change and vitality that the local church must adopt by an overwhelming majority. And then a coaching team works with the leadership to implement, to monitor, and to evaluate those adopted strategies. And usually this transpires over about an 18-month period. Where we currently have limitations in our VCI program is we're in need of more qualified, competent coaches for this initiative to continue into the future. So where does this impact the county seat congregations? These are the congregations that spread across some 52 counties in our annual conference, and they're vital for our witness in our annual conference. These are the churches and locations where you have a witness to a unique geographic area. These congregations are part of a support base many times for the smaller congregations around them. Their pastors are often seen as community leaders in a wider public square, and the outreach and mission of these congregations reach far beyond their immediate geographic area with significant impact. The data also indicates that some of these congregations have already participated in the VCI program, and we have seen some positive results there. But what we recognize is that 16 of these 52 county seat congregations have that average worship attendance of 201 or more. So we know they are a vital part of the future ministry and witness across our entire annual conference. But what we also see is that 14 of those 16 are in matrices where we need to pay some attention. they're not growing in a growth area, or they're not growing where their population and affinity group is declining. So these are identified as high potentials for our vibrant church initiative, and conference staff and team reach out to make that a possibility. Lastly, data as an indicator and a confirmation of strategy. We commissioned the Lewis Center for Church Leadership to analyze how the presence of young clergy, that is to say persons under the age of 35, were affecting the vitality of local congregations. We wanted to hear from them. We wanted to hear about the churches that they were serving. So a questionnaire was distributed, and 63 of 78 potential responders shared their story. And while the data is new and not statistically conclusive, it does indicate some positive trends. We have been successful in attracting and retaining young clergy. We have a high percentage of elders. From 2012, 14, and 15, the highest number of elders under the age of 35 in the denomination. And we ask, are there trends among these clergy at the time of commissioning that we should pay attention to? Here were some of our findings. 75% of these persons started out their candidacy within our conference. 40% have participated in our Advancing Pastoral Leadership 5-year cohort development program. 40% have debt from college, and 70% have debt from seminary. The aggregate debt, $1.3 million. The average debt, $39,000. Through our Ambassadors Grant Program, we can provide up to $25,000 in reimbursements for seminary expenses and thus reduce the burden on these young clergy. Some other things we discovered: where a young clergy under the age of 35 is the lead pastor, there is a 75% increase of regular participants who are also under the age of 35. In other words, those persons attract their generational peer groups. And where pastors serve as associates or staff under the age of 35, we've seen a 55% increase. Lead pastors grow their churches at a rate of 44%. In our conference, churches are growing at a rate of 38, and in the denomination at 34%. We also see the average worship attendance greatly increased where young clergy are appointed as lead pastors and providing stable and supportive roles as associate pastors who have a preaching role in the church to which they are assigned. In other words, our churches are growing both in terms of membership and an average worship attendance where we have deployed our young clergy. For those serving as lead pastors, 56 are in town and rural areas. For those in associate and staff roles, 75% are in suburban and urban areas. We also wanted to know about the morale factor. And so we asked clergy to respond with an agree or strongly agree on a 5-point semantic differential scale to statements. And when the respondent gave a 4 or a 5, we took note of that. For associates or staff pastors, their range was 46 to 89%, with the average morale score of 71.4. For lead pastors, the range was 63 to 97%, with an average morale score of 85.1. In 9 out of the 10 categories related to morale, there were higher scores for lead pastors with an average rate of 14%. Now, what does that mean statistically for us? One of the inferences, and here's where the confluence comes in. One of the inferences that we draw from this data is that our young pastors under the age of 35 can be placed in significantly and strategic areas in our county seat and large town areas. We know they are effective in growing churches by increasing both their affinity groups and the average worship attendance of their congregations. And we also know that where they're appointed as solo pastors, their morale is significantly higher. So what have we learned over the years of following data in the Texas Annual Conference? Well, to quote Lisa, data is our friend. We can use health records to identify at-risk and high-cost constituents so that we bring intervention, improvement of health, and provide cost savings to the annual conference, which in turn translates into increased funding for our programs and our goals and objectives. We can identify congregations that are vital for kingdom building. so we know which are critical, which ones have potential, so that the annual conference can offer resources to increase their fruitfulness and to sustain their future. And we've learned from the data collected from among young clergy that it's beneficial to appoint them as lead pastors or preaching associates so that they will attract their generation, grow congregations, and function at a higher level of morale. Data is our friend, and it's been a pleasure to share some of these examples.
Wow. Wow. I mean, think about that. Improving health improves vitality in congregations and provides more money for ministry and mission. You know, figuring out what young clergy need and where they are, and then targeting resources to help them stay in ministry in the church begins to turn congregations and conferences around. Figuring out, listen to this, figuring out that you're on a slide and the best way to turn around that slide is to cut the budget and watch the income grow and have more than $1 million for mission and ministry. It's all in the data. It's all in the data. So what I want you to do is just quickly find one other person, and you're each going to have 45 seconds to share with each other what was it that you heard today that made you think, or you felt like, yes, we're on the right track, or that's an aha for me. So just turn to one other person. What did you hear? One thing that you heard that really gave you new insight or reinforced something you're already doing. Great job. Yeah, it was fantastic. I was watching people take pictures of the slides. Write the stuff down. It's great. If you haven't already, switch to the other person. Switch to the other person if you haven't already. Okay, I invite you to come back. I invite you to come on back. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, right from where you are, just stand up and shout something that either resonated with you, gave you a new insight, or is reinforced something you're already doing. So just shout it out. I'll repeat it back to the whole group. So just stand up. Somebody stand up. A lot of people standing and stretching. Wait, shh, so we can hear folks. Who's got something to shout out? Change management. Working on change management is really critical, particularly when you begin to introduce new data and new information. Good. What else? Let congregations and clergy set their own goals. Here's the caveat to that. You have to give them parameters. What should they be setting goals on? You don't tell them what the goals should be, but these are the areas we should be setting goals. And you give them a parameter of how long of a period. So, for instance, in Greater New Jersey, for those that we wanted to see the giving rate go up, we said, you set the goal. The goal ultimately is 100%, and you've got 3 to 5 years to get there. You determine, so you give them the parameters. Good, what else? Okay, focus on a limited number of outcomes. Good. What else? All right, we got 2 going at once. Let's hear this one first. Strategic appointments with young leaders. And did you notice the examples? It was supporting them. So it wasn't just sending them there, but how do you get the resources and things to support? What else? Okay, you can't act on information you don't have. You heard Hector talk about square footage of a building. That's not in the statistical reports, but you can add it to the statistical reports. And so that's what some conferences are doing, adding that piece to get the data. What else? Yes, wellness is key. So figuring out where health of clergy are, health of congregations, and how do you build on that? Good. Anything else? Yes?
The importance of establishing approximate steps in reaching desired outcomes.
Yeah, nice. So establishing approximate steps. And, you know, what are the steps? So sometimes you don't tell people where you are ultimately are going because you don't know. But approximations, and which will continue to change over time. Good. What else? So this is one of the most important things, is how you work with people around the data. To just dump the numbers or broadcast is only going to demoralize. To come alongside of people and work with them is what's going to help them to understand it. One of the things we talk about in the church today is give the work back to the people. So what does it look like to share the data with them and ask a couple of questions? What are you learning from this? What do you see in this? What are your hopes because of this? What are your concerns because of this? Give it back to them. Don't tell them what the concerns are. You're declining in worship. If you don't stop now and turn around, you're going to die within 5 years. That's not helpful. It's just not helpful. But let them discover, let them understand and work with it. So I began by saying, God's grace is what the world needs today. I began by saying that God's power in the world, helping people to see the power of God's love, is what our mission is today. And we're seeing that in vital congregations. But nobody really wants to count. But let me tell you this. The people who have experienced God's grace, the people who have experienced the power of God, they want to be counted. 5,000 people fed. They wanted to be counted. 10 people healed. They wanted to be counted. People who are living because they didn't die of malaria want to be counted. Students who receive scholarships want to be counted. We may not like to count, but those who are experiencing God's grace are only too happy to be counted. Ours is to figure out what to do with that information that empowers more of God's grace, that multiplies God's activity in the neighborhood, that continues to move the church forward. In your bag when you registered, you got 2 great books. One by Mike Slaughter that talks about vitality and working on vitality. The other by Gil Rendell that talks about outcomes. We encourage you to form some study groups in your conferences and read those books and continue to talk about increasing vitality, looking at outcomes, measures, and how we move toward those things. Let's give thanks again to our presenters today and the great job that they did. Amen? God bless you all.